안녕하세요. 반갑습니다. 민주주의 온전한 회복을 생각하며 파머와의 대화의 시간을 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 오늘의 대담은 파머가 시작하신 미국 CCR 재단의 신뢰서클을 2008년부터 한국에서 열어온 교육센터 마음의씨앗에서 진행합니다. 기획 의도와 맥락을 잠시 말씀드리겠습니다. 작년 12.3 내란 사건 이후에 한국은 격동의 시간을 보냈습니다. 그 과정을 통과하면서 그리고 단기간에 해결되기 어려운 정치적 상황들 속에서 우리는 민주주의가 제도나 시스템뿐만이 아니라 일상에 구체적인 영향을 미치는 현실이라는 것을 피부로 느끼듯이 알아차리게 되었습니다. 마음의 씨앗의 신뢰서클 진행자들도 어떻게 민주주의 회복에 기여할 것인가를 고민하면서 다양한 서클과 대화 모임, 비통한 자들을 위한 정치학 책 모임, 또 5가지 마음의 습관 서클들을 열었습니다. 그러면서 변화를 경험하는 것과 동시에 고민이 깊어지고 질문이 이어졌습니다. 그러면서 민주주의를 마음과 연결해서 들려주시는 파머의 이야기를 듣고 싶었습니다. 파머의 글입니다. 우리는 다른 사람의 목소리에 귀를 기울이고 싶어 한다. 그러나 어떤 말을 듣게 될까 두려워서 이견을 가진 사람들과의 대화를 회피할 방법을 찾기도 한다. 우리는 동료 시민을 신뢰하고 싶어 한다. 그러나 가까운 사람을 포함해 타인에게 상처를 받아보았기에 낯선 사람들을 신뢰하기를 어려워한다. 인간의 마음이 민주주의의 첫 번째 집은 아니라 할지라도 민주주의의 첫 번째 토론장임에는 틀림이 없다. 운명적인 결과들을 함축하는 조용한 논쟁이 그곳에서 끊임없이 벌어지고 있는 것이다. 오늘 우리는 이 마음을 응시하며 이야기를 시작하려 합니다. 오늘 대담은 미국에서 지금 연결하고 계신 파머와 비통한 자들을 위한 정치학을 번역하고 또 파머와 오래 교류해 오신 신뢰서클 진행자 김찬호 교수님의 1대1 대화로 진행이 됩니다. 아쉽지만 시간상 별도의 질의응답 시간은 어렵습니다. 그래서 사전 기획 단계에서 신뢰서클 진행자들과 또 독서 모임들에서 해주신 질문들을 추려서 반영하였습니다. 네, 그럼 파머와 김찬호 교수님 모시겠습니다.
일요일 날 아침에 이렇게 함께 해주셔서 고맙습니다. 우리 공간이 아주 꽉 차고 충만한 그런 느낌입니다. 그동안 한국에서 파머의 책이 무려 10권이나 번역됐습니다. 한 권 빼놓고 다 됐거든요. 거의 다 번역된 거고, 그동안 한국의 독자들을 많이 만났습니다. 그리고 독자들이 여러 가지 활동을 했는데, 예를 들어 사진을 보여드리겠습니다. 이게 아까 브리스가 그 집에서 청년들이 모여서 파머의 비통한 자들을 위한 정치학 책을 함께 읽으면서 나눴던 그런 대화의 시간이 작년에 있었고요. 이건 바로 지난주 수요일 날 제가 함께 했던 그런 2번의 독서 모임이 있었습니다. 비통한 자들을 위한 정치학. 이런 모임들이 그동안 꾸준하게 있어 왔는데, 그에 비해서 우리 독자가 파머를 만난 건 오늘이 처음입니다. 이렇게 흔쾌하게 마음을 내주셔서 고마운데요. 몇 해 전에 파모께서 앞으로 일체 외부 활동은 안 하신다고 하셨는데 걱정하면서 요청을 드렸는데 기꺼이 응해 주셨습니다. 저희의 요청에 응해 주신 그 까닭을 좀 듣고 싶습니다.
Well, thank you. Well, I'm just delighted to be with you. When I said several years ago that I would be slowing down my work, it was because I was getting older and slower. I'm now 86, and so I have less energy, less bandwidth than I once did. But I have 2 reasons for wanting to be with you and for gratefully accepting this invitation. The first is personal. I have thought of all of you in the program over there as friends and colleagues for many years. Of course, some of you will remember, as I do, that you visited me at my home in Wisconsin a number of years ago, and we spent several days in a wonderful discussion about courage and renewal work, about gardening the seeds of the people's heart. And truth be told, I fell in love with all of you at that time. And that's what I mean by friends and colleagues. So any chance I have to be with you, I'm glad for it. The other reason I wanted to be with you tonight is political. I cannot think of a more important subject right now in my country, in your country, around the world, than the question, how can we help democracy survive and thrive? It is the question of our time. And my own country, the United States of America, which once I think stood as some sort of model exemplar of democracy for people around the world, has for several years now been on an international list of backsliding democracies. So we have our struggles here, very serious struggles. And I come to you as one knowing that you struggle too. I come not with answers, but I come with a willingness to talk about possibilities, about our most creative responses to this great political crisis of our time. So I'm deeply grateful for this chance and for all of you, and that's why I'm here.
저희 진행자분 중에 몇몇 사람들이 파머택에 방문한 게 2012년이었습니다. 벌써 13년이 흘렀는데 그때 기억을 아름답게 떠올려 주셔서 고맙습니다. 그리고 저희가 미국에서 들려오는 여러 가지 뉴스를 들을 때마다 굉장히 걱정스럽고 늘 생각했어요. 파머 선생님이 얼마나 지금 마음이 아프실까 이런 걱정을 했습니다. 그래서 첫 번째 질문으로 드리겠습니다. 비통한 자들을 위한 정치학 초판이 2011년에 출판되었습니다. 한국에서도 많은 독자들이 이렇게 읽었는데요. 그 책이 나온 지 이제 13년 만에 2024년에 개정판이 나왔습니다. 이 책을 개정하게 된 그런 계기나 상황이 있는지 여쭙고 싶습니다.
Yes, I wrote Healing the Heart of Democracy in
그래서 제가 그
2011
책을
because
2011년에 썼죠.
I was already seeing the struggle that was going on in our democracy, really around embracing diversity, racial diversity, religious diversity, diversity of national origin, diversity in sexual orientation, diversity in political beliefs. Already in 2011, I was seeing a backlash to the election of our first Black president, Barack Obama, and coming out from under rocks in this country was all kinds of racism and homophobia and anti-Muslim sentiment in the wake of 9/11. And every bit of it seemed to me to be an insult to the founders of this country, an insult to all of us who understand that democracy is about the creative potentials of human diversity. We know in the natural world that ecological diversity is critical to an ecosystem surviving and thriving. It's precisely the diversity of plant and animal life that make the natural world resilient and inventive and resistant to calamities. And when we lose ecological diversity, we get certain features of the climate crisis we're in today. Well, the same thing is true of human diversity in democracy. We need that diversity to stimulate creativity. We need that diversity to give us resilience. We need that diversity in order to grow in a world that is amazingly and beautifully diverse. But what I saw in 2011 in this country was the rise of profound fear around diversity. And then I saw the rise of politicians in our Republican Party especially, who were exploiting the fear of diversity in order to gain votes. It's the oldest political trick in the book to make us afraid of one another across our creative lines of difference in order to divide and conquer us. I don't know if that's a familiar phrase in Korea, but certainly in American political science, the idea of divide and conquer has been around for a long time. And it's a very accurate description of how our current president first rose to power in his first time in office, elected in 2016 and serving until 2020. And now, after 4 years out of office, back in office again, this time with his authoritarian agenda ramped up on steroids, exponentially increased with the help of Project 2025, which is a chilling blueprint for an authoritarian takeover. And all of it, of course, is in service of the wealth and power of just a few people, while many in our society, the most vulnerable among us, the most needy among us, go unattended, uncared for. As the old saying goes, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. So this is an existential crisis. It is fueled in part by our fear of diversity. It is fueled in part by political leaders who manipulate that fear for their own selfish ends. And the only response possible is from we, the people. The only containment on authoritarianism is resistance and non-cooperation, well-organized resistance and non-cooperation. So the book was issued in a new edition a year or two ago because all of that was clearly underway. And in the meantime, the pandemic had come along and further weakened our social fabric, further weakened our network of relationships on which democracy is so heavily dependent. In earlier books published years ago, I wrote about what I called the public life or the pre-political layer of our society, which are all of those ways in which we gather together in families, in neighborhoods, in public spaces, in schools, in religious communities, in voluntary organizations of many sorts, all of the ways we gather together to weave the civil society, to weave the network of relationships that makes democracy possible and that can call democracy back when leaders come along to exploit our differences. All of this was so badly broken down by the pandemic that historical tragedy, I think, is part of what we're dealing with today. But that's why the book needed a revision and a revival. And I'm happy to say that it is drawing readers and study groups in this country as well as in Korea in an effort to help people understand the situation we're in and to give them some practical tools for dealing with it.
저희는 이제 뉴스를 보면서 외형적으로 대통령이 바뀌고 이런 거 미국에서 그런 것만 보고 있는데 지금 말씀 들으니까 트럼프 대통령이 들어오기 전부터 그런 두려움이 이용되고 그런 조짐이 있었다는 거 그걸 새롭게 알게 되었습니다. 근데 지금 파머께서 새로운 개정판을 쓰시면서 긴 서문에 여러 가지 내용을 담으셨거든요. 근데 거기에 보면 어떤 정치적 견해나 입장이 맞지 않는 그런 친구들, 그런 가족들, 저희들도 많이 경험하고 있는데 그런 사람들과 이렇게 대면할 때 여러 가지 감정적 갈등에 빠지고 관계가 단절되기도 합니다. 그럴 때 사회가 굉장히 긴장이 심화되거든요. 우리가 늘 경험하는 건데 미국에서도 그럴 테고요. 이런 상황에서 우리가 어떻게 지혜를 찾을 수 있을지 말씀 부탁드립니다.
Well, again, this is something that we're dealing with great difficulty and pain here in the United States. So again, we're sharing experiences and possibilities because I think we're both in a very similar situation. I think the first thing to recognize is that it's a classic strategy of authoritarianism, of totalitarianism, of fascism, to make people so suspicious of one another that you're not even sure who you can talk to in your own family. You're not sure who you can talk to among your friends. You're not sure who you can talk to among your colleagues. If you're teachers, you may have concerns about who you can talk with among your students. And so it goes. Because again, at the heart of any authoritarian strategy, political strategy, is breaking up the social relationships that weave a community that can amplify our voices and help us call our political system back to health, back to democracy. So I think it's critical for people to understand that this isn't happening by accident. This is happening by design. And for some people, at least, when they understand that it's happening by design, there's something in the human spirit that says, I'm not going to fall for this. I'm not going to take the bait. I'm going to talk, because talking openly, as we're doing here right now, is one of the most important things we can do to preserve our democratic system, to not be afraid of openly sharing our convictions, our hearts, the best thoughts of our minds in a public way. And I think every public person in this society, including some of our elected officials, is on high alert today about how they may become the targets of unconstitutional governmental action, depending on what they say. And I am among those who says, I'm still not going to be quiet. I'm still not going to shut up, because I'm a citizen of this democracy, and I have and will always have a right to speak. Now, among our intimate relationships, among family and friends, I think one of the most important things we can do is to try to ease our way into political conversations by not making them political at first. One of the most successful approaches that people in this country have taken to those conversations, and I take them in my own work, is to begin with personal storytelling. Tell the story of how you came to believe what you believe in today. And if you listen openly, it's often quite fascinating to realize that despite your political differences, you share personal experiences at a very deep level, because ultimately there is more that we share than that in which we differ. And the stories of our lives bring those things out. We could go on at great length about particular questions that can be raised, and ways of listening with care, without judgment, just listening, and eventually getting to the point of talking about why it is that you hold different political views based on your different and your shared life experiences. Because one thing we know about human beings is that two people can have very similar life experiences, but interpret them in quite different ways. But somehow what we're doing when we start with the stories of our lives is to create a container that at least gives us a chance to sustain a relationship long enough to get into more complicated and more contested, conflicted topics like political opinions. But if we start out with political opinions and viewpoints, the odds are that we're not going to get very far with those with whom we differ. I wrote a piece this last week that appears on my Substack page. I don't know if Substack is known in Korea, this platform for expression that many people in this country are now using. But I have a Substack page called Living the Questions with Parker J. Palmer. And this last week, I wrote about taking our close relationships a step farther than what I just said. And that, in my mind, has to do with what I call bearing witness. Bearing witness. Witnessing to what we believe to be true in a straightforward, non-judgmental way that simply says, this is what I believe, and this is why I believe it. I believe in love, truth, and justice, and here's why. I can make that statement without insulting anybody. And if it challenges people close to me, if it challenges members of my family, if it challenges friends and colleagues, then let's talk about it. I've said nothing that would insult them. I've said nothing that would alienate them, but I have made it clear that I have some core beliefs that relate to politics that are very close to the heart of who I am, very close to the core of my identity and integrity. And if I can't express those in the face of people with whom I want to have a relationship, then what kind of relationship is it? How can you have an authentic relationship with another person if you cannot be yourself in that relationship? I'm not saying I have an answer to that question, but I'm saying it's an important question. I try to make it clear to everybody in my life, I hope we can sustain our relationship. I hope we can continue to be trusting family members or trustworthy friends. But if we can't express who we really are, me to you, you to me, then what kind of relationship do we have? So I think that's probably the extent of what I can say right now. There's a range of possibilities about how to hold these difficult relationships. And we have to be discerning about what to do in any given situation. I heard today from a woman who had a very sad story to tell. She had two sons. One of them committed suicide not long ago. I don't know why. She's desperate to stay in relationship to her other son, despite the fact that they differ radically in their political views. And of course, I would not ask her to do anything other than try to stay in that relationship in any way possible, because they need each other. So there's always discerning to be done about priorities. But there's a wide range of relationships in which I believe the political crisis in my country is so severe right now. We are so close to the tipping point into some sort of authoritarianism that I put priority on bearing witness about my democratic convictions with a small d, my convictions about democracy in a wide range of relationships with exceptions like the one I just noted.
예, 굉장히 섬세한 그런 마음이 필요하다는 생각이 듭니다. 자기의 개인적인 이야기를 먼저 나누는 것, 그리고 또 민주주의의 증인이 되는 그런 마음을 갖는 거에 굉장히 소중한 지혜로 다가옵니다. 근데 이제 덧붙여서 질문 드리고 싶은 것은 사적 관계를 넘어서서 사회적으로 굉장히 공격적으로 말도 안 되는 어떤 가짜 뉴스나 이런 걸 가지고 막 억지로 주장하는 사람들이 있거든요. 그런 분들을 대할 때 그러니까 모든 다양성을 다 중시할 수는 없잖아요. 모든 차이를 다 존중할 수는 없다고 보는데 그 경계선을 어디에 둬야 될지 그런 질문을 드리고 싶습니다.
Let me try, and then you tell me whether I've understood. All right? Yes, I'll count on you, Zelda and Aloha, to tell me if I understand correctly. As I understand it, you're asking about right action, right political action, correct, just, loving political action against violence in any direction. And this leads me to say and to affirm, as part of my bearing witness, that I have a profound belief in the importance and in the efficacy of non-violence. It seems to me that violent answers to our problems only lead to one more thing, which is more violence. And I've never understood long run why we are so wedded to the belief that violence solves problems. It sometimes gives a temporary fix, and there may be moments at which we have little or no choice. But we do have choices often. And when we have a choice, I think nonviolence is what moves us forward. I'm old enough in this country to remember the nonviolent social change movement of the mid-20th century in the United States, led by Martin Luther King Jr., whose focus, of course, was Black liberation, was the human rights and the voting rights of Black Americans who for 13 generations had been deprived of all of that and systematically deprived of generational wealth or opportunities to raise their children in healthy environments, safe environments, and all of that needed to change. And because of that nonviolent movement of the mid-20th century, because of that nonviolent movement of the mid-20th century, a great deal was achieved in law. Some of those achievements have now come undone, but in the past 65 years, a lot has been established that has given people of color in our society a much stronger political platform, has given them much amplified voices, and it was accomplished through nonviolence. My belief in resisting this current manifestation of authoritarianism, of racism, of homophobia, all of which is represented by the Trump administration, is that our resistance must be nonviolent. And there is, in this country, an organization that I regard as very important called Indivisible. Indivisible. They're online all over the place. And this is the organization that has been sponsoring and facilitating many, many efforts at nonviolent resistance to the current administration. This includes, as you probably know, if you follow events in the U.S., this includes these national days of protest, such as the No Kings Day, and more recently one in honor of the great civil rights activist John Lewis, called the Make Good Trouble Day, or the Good Trouble Day, because John Lewis was famous for saying we must make good trouble in order to push back on racism and all the other isms. And millions of Americans, more millions every time one of these rallies is held, have come out for these rallies across the country. I believe the last rally the last major rally on a weekend, no King's Day, drew over 6 million people to the streets of America. And this is classic nonviolence. It has contributed, I'm quite sure, to the declining popularity of our current president in the public opinion polls. His poll numbers are now very, very bad. That does not mean that it will be an easy road to contain the destructive impact he's having on our democracy. But it at least establishes a foundation of popular support for anything but what we've got right now. So if I understood the question right, and please tell me if I didn't, I think it has to do with the importance of nonviolence and with all of the kind of education and training that goes into nonviolence, which we must never forget. The civil rights movement of the mid-20th century in this country, led by Martin Luther King Jr., was based on deeply thoughtful personal and group training of those who joined in the resistance. The training that allowed them to receive the blows of the nightsticks, the truncheons, the clubs of the police and the military without hitting back. And it was absolutely critical to the success of the movement. So most of the public forums we need to have around these issues, including, as you know, the work of the Center for Courage and Renewal and your own work in Korea, with which we're very much partnered and for which we're very grateful to you. All of that work of holding spaces, safe spaces for public dialogue, requires careful training and preparation of those who facilitate it. So I include the work of the Center for Courage and Renewal and the Gardening the People's Hearts. I include that in the toolkit of nonviolent social change because it provides those safe spaces for discussion and for personal growth and for the growth of communities of resistance that we so badly need.
네, 고맙습니다. 지금 말씀해 주신 것과 관련된 질문인데요. 그런 시민운동이 다양하게 지금 이루어지고 있는데 특히 이 책을 읽으신 독자들께서 공적 공간에서 활동을 다양하게 하실 거라고 생각합니다. 그런 것이 어떤 모습인지, 그다음에 지금 Center for Courage and Renewal에서 그런 과정을 어떻게 매개하고 플랫폼으로 작동하고 계신지 그런 걸 좀 여쭙고 싶습니다.
Well, let me say that in our current political circumstances, a lot of people began when they realized what was happening under this new administration. They began by falling into despair. And that, despair is always accompanied by loneliness, and it breeds loneliness, isolation. And so as people began wrestling with despair, and we began hearing, what do you need to come out of this state of disempowerment, which is exactly where these authoritarians want you to be. The answer always was, I need relationships. I need community. You know, it doesn't have to be a big community. Community never has to be measured in the dozens or hundreds of people. It can be just a few people who encourage each other, who support each other, who understand each other. You know, people with whom you have no need to explain why you're struggling or what your struggle is all about. And so, as we heard more and more of that, we began gathering people online and in person in our circle of trust model, which you also use, of course, in your own way, in your own wonderful adaptations. And this is a model in which people are free to speak what's on their hearts without fear of judgment or rejection or anyone trying to fix them, quote, fix them or save them, but simply the act of expression, to get it out where you can look at it, and then to hear other people getting their voices into the circle, telling their truth. And what always amazes me about these circles, and I've been, you know, we started this work 30 years ago, so I've been in a lot of circles, and I've experienced this form of non-judgmental community very often. What always amazes me is that people can have the same problem, the same struggle. They can find that no one has, quote, an answer to that, but they can still come out of the circle feeling strengthened and empowered because they suddenly realize, I'm not alone with this. I'm not the only one in the universe who feels this way. And that puts a platform under us. It puts ground under our feet, ground that we can stand on and move forward a bit and start making progress with. And so eventually we do come up with the next step and the next step and the next step. But the first step out of despair, which is where a lot of people have been during these hard times in American democracy, times when we've said, how did this guy get in again? What's wrong with people that they would vote for this? The first steps out of that kind of despair are in relationship where nobody has the answer for you, but somehow together you feel the solidarity that allows you to start moving into the issue rather than backing away from it and falling into even more despair.
예, 책에서 말씀하신 민주주의의 마음의 습관, 이 부분이 새삼스럽게 다가옵니다. 그런 것을 실천한 여러 가지 사례들이 있었을 텐데, 근데 문제는 이제 신뢰서클이라는 걸 저희가 해왔습니다. 근데 그 신뢰서클을 경험하지 못한 분들과도 이런 민주주의 주제를 가지고 이제 대화를 만들어 가야 되는데, 그 안전한 공간을 형성하려고 할 때, 그렇게 신뢰서클을 경험하지 못한 분들과 할 때 어떤 것을 좀 유념해야 될지 이런 질문 드리고 싶습니다.
Yeah, you know, we began our work, and I think you did too, with teachers. I think many of you are teachers, and we found it important to start with people who share a particular kind of work in the society. We knew something about their problems of isolation, problems of being asked to live up to standards, educational standards that aren't necessarily in the best interest of their students or of them. Having to press up against a system that depends too much, for example, on standardized testing, which, as far as I can tell, does no one very much good. And so we gathered these teachers in a way that said, we don't have the answers to your problems, but we believe that you have the answers. And we believe we have a process that will allow you to get at the answers that are within you and between you, that come up from the human heart, the human mind, the human spirit, and that live between us as we engage in deep and meaningful conversation. And so we started facilitating that. And of course, what that takes is a facilitator who understands how to protect the safety of that circle of trust. Circle of trust, what we call our gatherings of maybe 25 teachers who take this journey together over a period of time. And there's a lot to be said about what it takes to be a good facilitator. I think you know I wrote a whole book about that called A Hidden Wholeness, in which I spell out some of the details of good facilitation. And more of that, of course, is available at the website of the Center for Courage and Renewal. A lot of material is there. So I don't think there's a lot I can say about it here, but I'll try at least this one critical piece. And I don't know how this is going to translate into your context, but I'll give it a try. So in our circles of trust, we have a ground rule, a mutual understanding that no matter what gets said, people will not try to fix, save, advise, or correct each other. They will not try to fix each other or save each other or advise each other or correct each other. Because as soon as we do that, the conversation kind of ends. I don't know if you've ever had the experience, I have, of taking a problem to someone because I want to explore it. And as soon as they hear the problem, they say, oh, I know what you should do about that because I had that problem too. And here's what worked for me. Here's what fixed me. Here's what saved me. And as soon as I hear that, I think, you can't possibly know how this problem feels to me because you're not me. There's a real arrogance in assuming that we know how to fix another person. But people know how to fix themselves if we can listen deeply and give them plenty of opportunity to explore their inner resources and can put them in a situation with others where everybody is exploring their inner resources and things start to emerge between us. I have a very vivid memory, and again, I don't know if the humor in this will translate culturally, but I have a very vivid memory of the first time I told a group of 25 teachers that we were going to spend 2 years together through a series of 8 retreats of 3 days each. And that during that entire time, there would be no fixing, no saving, no advising, and no correcting each other. Across the circle from me was a man who was a math teacher, and he almost shouted at me, well, what in God's name are we going to be doing? You've just taken away the only things we like to do or know how to do. And we all laughed, but the laugh was based on our recognition that that is exactly true, that we spend a lot of time trying to fix, save, advise, or correct each other. Here's what you ought to do. You got that wrong. My advice to you is rather than creating a space of listening where people can come up with their own inner responses to their own dilemmas, which are the only ones that work. Maybe there's a standardized fix out there for them, but it won't work until they are ready to say, yes, this is my way forward. So this, it seems to me, is one of the keys to being a good facilitator. How do you protect a space against all of our natural instincts to fix, save, advise, and correct other people? There are ways to do that, but this probably isn't the moment to go into great detail about that.
예, 저희가 해온 일을 다시 한번 그 의미를 부여해 주셔서 고맙습니다. 드리고 싶은 질문 많지만 다음 질문으로 넘어가겠습니다. 선생님이 쓰신 책에 이런 구절이 있거든요.
당신 안에서 그리고 당신 주변의 세상에서 다음에 무슨 일이 일어날지는 당신의 마음이 어떻게 부서지느냐에 달려있다. 만약 마음이 산산조각 난다면 분노와 우울, 무관심이 그 결과가 될 것이다. 하지만 그 마음이 인간 경험의 복잡성과 모순을 품어낼 수 있는 더 큰 그릇으로 열리게 된다면 새로운 삶이 시작될 수 있다.
이렇게 돼 있는데요. 이런 질문이 어떤 청년 스터디 모임에서 나왔습니다. 이 말이 머릿속은 이해가 되는데 실제 삶에서는 와닿지 않는다는 겁니다. 삶에서 마음이 산산조각 나는 게 아니라 더 열릴 수 있게 하려는 것, 어떻게 하면 될 수 있을지, 정치적으로 폭력적 의견을 가진 사람들에게 분노, 복수심 이런 걸 느낄 때가 많은데 그런 감정을 어떻게 바꿀 수 있을지 이런 고민이 있거든요. 예.
Well, thank you for a very heartfelt question. Behind the question, I sense a heart that is already open. So I think maybe the questioner knows more about the question than he or she thinks they do, simply because they can ask that kind of question, which is so self-aware of the desire to be more open, but honest about our frequent tendency to turn toward vengeance. So let me just say a couple of things about this question that I find important, because it is an important question. I think the first question we always have to ask ourselves when we find ourselves dominated by a particular emotion, such as vengeance or anger, when we find ourselves not only having that feeling, but moving toward acting on that feeling in a direct way, I think we have to ask ourselves, what good is that going to do me? Or how will it, in any possible way, positively impact the other person? How could it lead to change? And I think vengeance, is a good example of that. We have a writer in this country whose insights I value a lot. Her name is Anne Lamott. And she wrote a wonderful sentence once about vengeance. She says, putting vengeance into action is like drinking rat poison and waiting for the rat to die. I think when I think about that, her point becomes very clear. Vengeance brings me down, but it doesn't bring down the person at whom I feel vengeful. Anger is a similar emotion. I think I'm not afraid of any emotion. Emotions are emotions. What matters is what you do with them. And in the case of anger, there are things to be angry about. And I don't know of a single spiritual tradition or wisdom tradition that simply says it's wrong to get angry. I think what's wrong is acting on anger in a way that is death-dealing rather than life-giving. What's wrong with anger is when you acted on it in ways that are destructive rather than full of possibility. There's a lot of anger in this society today, but to go back to where I was a moment ago, when you can harness that anger as an energy and use it to animate, to fuel nonviolent action, then you've made good use of your anger. If you simply go out into the world and start punching people out or tearing things down because of your anger, you're not going to get anywhere good for yourself or for the society. So that would be one level of answer to an important question is, I think, a self-aware life asks, what will be the impact on me if I simply act on this raw emotion rather than translating it into some kind of positive energy? The other thing I want to say is this person asked about heartbreak and the transformation of heartbreak from death into life. And I think when I was young, I wouldn't have understood that very well either. But I'm 86, and I have at this stage of life seen a lot of people lose to death the person most important in their lives. And for quite a while, in some cases, those people go underground, feeling that in the wake of this loss, life will never be worth living again, because this person whom they have lost was so much the heart and soul of meaning in their lives. They may spend a long time underground with those feelings of darkness. But in so many cases, I have seen people my age or around my age, eventually, without really knowing this was happening, emerge back into the light with the realization that they have become larger people, more understanding people, more loving people, more forgiving people. Their hearts have broken open, not apart. And that's where I got the idea of two ways for the heart to break. One is when it shatters into 1,000 pieces and is no longer able to function as a heart. And sometimes, as it shatters, it gets thrown like a fragment grenade at the ostensible source of its pain. But the other way is for the heart to break open into largeness, not in spite of the loss, but because of the loss. Precisely because of the loss. Because loss does have the capacity to make us larger. more understanding, more forgiving, more compassionate. And so for me, this image isn't something I just dreamed up. The image is something I've seen happen in real life among real people as they work to hold both the darkness and the light that comes with all of our lives.
예, 우리가 살면서 겪게 되는 수많은 상실과 분노 이런 것에 대해서 어떻게 잘 대응해야 될지 알아차림이라는 그런 키워드로 잘 풀어주셨습니다. 자연스럽게 그 다음 질문이 연결이 되는데요. 이런 감정과 함께 우리 한국 사회에 지금 많이 퍼져 있는 감정이 갈등과 혐오입니다. 그러니까 정치적 위기를 일단 넘기긴 했지만 여전히 우리가 사회적으로 적대적인 그런 세력들이 많이 있고 이런 현실 속에서 무력감, 냉소 이런 것에 빠질 때가 많습니다. 공적 사회에 대해서 우리가 건강한 관심을 유지하려면 우리가 서로의 마음을 돌보아야 될 텐데 어떤 걸 함께 할 수 있을까요? 이런 질문 드리고 싶습니다.
Well, I think you can do things like this, like what we're doing right now, to talk openly about these things and to share different ways of looking at them. I don't know about you, but I always find it helpful when I can get together with a group of friends and I can tell them how I feel about X or Y or Z. And I start hearing the many different ways in which people look at that same thing and come up with very different feelings and perspectives and approaches. And sometimes in the course of that kind of conversation, I will find myself saying, wow, I could look at the way she's looking at it too, or the way he's looking at it too. And I'm learning something that opens me that I would never, ever have thought of if I were simply sitting in solitude with my problem and with my cynicism and sense of helplessness. I think the flat out simple truth of the matter is that when we stay in isolation with our feelings, we are helpless, period. So if we feel helpless in isolation, that's because we are. None of this is going to yield to one person's approach or to one person's action. None of us is able to save ourselves. We have to band together. We need each other. And so, part of me just looks at these authoritarians who want to split us up and says, no, I'm not going to let you do that. That's bad for my health. And it's bad for the health of the people I care about. And it's bad for the health of a democracy that I treasure. It's the exact opposite of wisdom over the years. In every culture and every tradition I know anything about. We need each other. We need community. We are born from community, we live in community, and we die into community. We become the ancestors. And that's a point I'd like to make about the ancestors. And I think it will resonate in Korean culture and elsewhere in Asia, as I understand it, and certainly in my own life. My generation, this generation, has accomplished nothing all by itself. It's always building on the shoulders of our ancestors. And our ancestors have seen all of this before. And they are still with us in so many important ways if we call them to consciousness. They are still with us, encouraging us. They are still with us, saying, we made it through hard times, so can you. This is their legacy to us. This is their gift to us. And they are part of our community, part of the community we desperately need, precisely because they've seen it all and done it all. I learned this lesson from my Black brothers and sisters in the nonviolent civil rights movement, who are constantly talking about the ancestors without whom they wouldn't be here, and the ancestors whom they invoke regularly for strength and for guidance. And in their case, they're talking about 12, 13, 14 generations of enslaved human beings in this country who had very few degrees of freedom, if any, but they used what little they had as best they could to start to expand their freedom, to start to express themselves religiously, culturally, musically, politically. And in that expression, step by step, bit by bit, brick by brick, they built the foundation on which today's activists stand. And awareness of their gift to us is an awareness of the largeness of the community in which we stand, on which we stand, to which we owe a debt. All of us are going to be ancestors one day. And it's good practice to turn to the ancestors and ask again, what do you have to teach us? Because their teachings are encouraging, their teachings are empowering. So your question asks, what can we do together to maintain a healthy interest in the public world? What can we do to care for each other's hearts? I think so much of it comes down to we can love each other. We can and we can express that love through acts of caring, such as the awareness that what happens to the least of us happens to me too. I'm a pretty well-off, pretty affluent American. I'm a straight white male. I'm the kind of person this country was created to favor, which is part of the injustice in this country long term. If I can be aware that I don't live my life in isolation, that what happens to those who are marginalized, to those who are impoverished, to those who are oppressed, to those who suffer, also happens to me and to people like me, because we are bound together in this community that includes those of us who are still here and those of us who are long gone. Then my heart opens to ask the question, what can I do today to make life a little better for everyone? We've been talking in this country a lot about hope, and some people are saying, I just don't have hope anymore. And when they ask me, do you have hope? My first answer is, I don't know how I'd live without it. If I am hopeless, what am I supposed to do? Sit on a stool facing the corner, feeling sorry for myself? That doesn't seem to me like a fit way for a grown-up to live. But I also have a definition of hope that I live by. And it's very simple. It goes like this. Hope is staying keenly aware of the difference between what is and what could and should be, the gap between what is and what could and should be, and each day doing something, no matter how small, that will help close that gap. That's hope. Hope is an action. Hope is a verb. We are to do hope, not just to have hope.
우리가 눈앞에 있는 일들에만 이렇게 매몰되어 있을 때가 많은데 더 긴 시야로 바라볼 수 있게 해주셨고, 특히 커뮤니티가 우린 살고 있는 동시대인만 생각했는데 조상들까지 포함해서 바라봐야 된다는 그 관점이 큰 도움이 됩니다. 그래서 연결된 질문인데요. 이제 저희가 8월 15일이 되면 광복 80주년을 맞습니다. 일본의 속박에서 벗어난 지 80년이 됐는데 미국에도 비슷한 독립기념일이 있다고 알고 있습니다. 이 독립기념일은 선생님께 어떤 의미가 있는지요? 또 광복을 맞이하게 될 광복절을 맞이하는 한국 사람들에게 어떤 말씀을 해주시고 싶으신지요?
Well, I want to say that as we become aware across cultures, across nations, of these important historical moments in which we were able to celebrate liberation, let's join hands in understanding that liberation is what the human spirit, the human soul, deserves and demands. And let's never give up on the struggle to achieve liberation for everyone, because none of us is liberated until all of us are. That's part, I think, of being aware of the community bonds that hold us together. In the case of our Independence Day, the 4th of July, of course, it was the day in which we declared independence from the King of England and from his autocratic authoritarian rule. And now Americans are challenged to celebrate that day in the face of a president who wants to be king, a president, along with the Supreme Court of the United States, which has given that president king-like powers, so that instead of us being a nation of laws and not men, which was a big part of why we declared independence, so that we could become a nation of laws and not men, we are going back to a nation of men who call the shots. And that's unacceptable. And so these Independence Days, they keep challenging us with new forms of opposition to what they were about in the first place. And we have to translate and declare independence all over again. I don't know if what I read about your Independence Day is accurate, but the literal translation of the Korean name for this day I read is the day the light returned. I don't know if that's accurate, but that's what one text said. Whether that's true or not, I love it. I love the notion that independence means the day when light returns. I mentioned an article that I wrote on my Substack page last week about bearing witness. And in that article, I told this story, which I'll end my answer with. It's a very moving story for me about one of the most remarkable men I've ever known. His name was Joel Elkes. He grew up in Lithuania. And before the Nazis invaded Lithuania, his parents sent him to England for an education. The fact that they did that saved Joel's life. And he went on to use that education to great effect and influence. He became one of the world's leading researchers on the chemistry of the brain and the chair of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins University in the US, a very distinguished institution. He died a few years ago at age 101. But during the Holocaust, he lost 11 members of his family when the Nazis took over Lithuania and murdered 95% of Lithuanian Jews. Joel was one of the most compassionate, loving, generous, affirming, and really funny people I've ever known. He's a great example for me of the heart broken open into largeness, because I can't imagine a more heartbreaking life than Joel Elke's led. And some years back, I facilitated a circle of trust of which Joel was a member. This was in the wake of 9/11 and the Iraq War, which of course was based on falsehoods. We sat in the circle talking about how to create safe spaces for truth tellers in a world that is based so often on lies. Joel listened for quite a while, and as our conversation was coming to a break, he spoke so eloquently for 5 minutes or so with a phrase that I'll never forget. And this is back in the early, this is back probably almost 20 years ago. He said, "Darkness is falling on our world, so we must learn to become gardeners in the dark." Perfect image for gardening the people's hearts, it seems to me. Darkness is falling fast on our world, so we must learn to become gardeners in the dark. And I believe that our Independence Days call all of us to become gardeners in the night, and also, like Joel, bearers of the light. The day of the light returned. So I'll leave it there.
예, 한국의 광복절과 미국의 독립기념일이 이렇게 연결될 줄 몰랐습니다. 그리고 우리 광복절 한자로 쓰니까 빛의 돌아옴 이렇게 생각 안 해봤는데 좀 놀랍습니다. 많은 독자들이 오랫동안 파머 선생님의 책을 통해서 특히 민주주의의 위기에 빠졌을 때마다 큰 위로와 용기가 되었습니다. 앞으로도 그렇게 되어주실 거라고 생각하는데 이렇게 또 오늘 새삼 얼굴을 대면하니까 굉장히 다른 울림으로 다가왔습니다. 이제 마지막으로 그렇다면 우리가 이제 민주주의를 계속 지탱하고 회복해가는 과정에서 마음이 중요하다고 생각하는 한국 사람들이 있는데 우리를 포함해서 우리들에게 해주시고 싶은 말씀 있으면 부탁드립니다.
Well, I want to take these words I'll say they're not my final words, but they're words at the end of this webinar. So I'm very careful with the language that way, you know. So I want to say that you inspire me too. It's just extraordinary for me to know that we are hands across the ocean, and that so much of what I care about and so much of what you care about has been able to connect, and that it resonates deeply with each other. It's another living example of the fact that we have so much more in common than our differences, the differences between us. Those differences pale to insignificance when I think of what we have in common at the level of heart and mind and soul, and the big questions that we carry about life. In that, we are united. I'm deeply grateful for your partnership, for your friendship, for your companionship. And those of you who were at my home all those years ago will remember not only the discussions we had, but you will remember our trip to a nearby ice cream shop, right? So I want to say that anybody on this call, or anybody who's read one of my books, wants to come to Madison, Wisconsin and visit me, I will take you out to ice cream, my treat. All right. So you can put that in the bank. Thank you.
예, 저희 마음의씨앗에서 위스콘신 메디슨 카운티 아이스크림 투어를 기획해서 추진하도록 하겠습니다. 오늘 이렇게 정말 소중한 시간, 힘든 상황에서 내주셨고요. 저에게 많은 울림과 새로운 생각, 그런 우리 초대해 주셨습니다. 눈물이 나와서 말씀을 잘 못 드리겠는데, 이렇게 해서 오늘 소중한 말씀 감사드리고 마무리하겠습니다. 예, 고맙습니다.
네, 너무 감사합니다. 저희가 화면을 통해서지만 굉장히 깊이 연결되었음을, 공명했음을 느끼고 있습니다. 처음에 시작할 때와 다르게 모두의 표정이 굉장히 풀려 있고요. 네, 눈빛들이 굉장히 생생해졌습니다. 오늘 파머의 말씀에 정말 너무나 감사드리고, 이 자리에 함께 하신 분들은 파머가 이야기하신 진실된 삶의 이야기를, 자기 이야기를 할 수 있는 안전한 공간들을 만드는데 자기 생의 시간을 많이 내어놓으신 분들입니다. 우리가 민주주의와 내란을 이야기하면서 뭐 하트, 소울, 러브, 호프 이렇게 파머가 이야기하신 이야기들이 굉장히 추상적이고 아이디어란 얘기 아니냐라는 이야기를 했지만, 오늘 파머의 말씀을 통해서 사실은 그것이 정말 구체적이고 현실적이고 그리고 민주주의 근간을 만드는 일이라는 것을 우리가 다시 한번 느끼게 됩니다. 한국 사회에서 이 안전한 공간, 네, 세이프 스페이스들이 정말 더 많이 늘어나기를 바라고, 우리가 그 커뮤니티의 일원이 되어서 민주주의 증인들이, 여기 계신 한 분 한 분들이 이미 증인이시고 또 증인이 되어 주실 것을, 그리고 서로가 그 증인으로 살기 위해서 커뮤니티로 서로 지지할 것을 기대하게 됩니다. 너무나도 감사드리고요. 네, 오늘도 빛과 어둠이 함께 하시겠지만, 네, 빛으로 그것들을, 네, 선택하시는 하루가 되시기를 바라고요. 오늘의 대담은 추후에 자막 편집본을 이렇게 만들게 됩니다. 그래서 이제 온라인에 공개가 됩니다. 그리고 8월 15일에는요, 한겨레 신문에 오늘 기사가 나가게 됩니다. 그것들 잘 보시고 연결해 주시면 좋겠습니다. 교육센터 마음의 씨앗에, 네, 궁금하신 점들 언제든, 네, 연락 주시면 되겠습니다. 네, 오늘의 자리를, 네, 마무리하도록 하겠습니다. 네, 닫겠습니다. 저희 안전한 공간에서, 안전한 공간을 만드는 자리에서, 네, 대화의 자리에서 또 뵙겠습니다. 파머 아이스크림 가게에서 꼭 만나기를 바라면서 저희 인사 나누시겠습니다. 감사합니다.